Oh, there we go. Okay, so this paper is actually a paper that I wrote for our Humane Hoax anthology. The paper itself is Spiritual Bypass and Manipulation in Do-It-Yourself Slaughter. I'll define those terms a little bit in a minute. And I won't actually cover manipulation per se in this talk. The second half of the paper that I wrote for the anthology covers manipulation and the ethics of manipulation as well too. This talk will be restricted to spiritual bypass. So you can see there's a few different acronyms here that I'll be using. DIYs, do-it-yourself, DIY slaughter, do-it-yourself slaughter, and do-it-yourselfers. These are all just acronyms that I use. So if you see these on the PowerPoint, you'll know what I'm referring to there. So the publication for the anthology is forthcoming. It's edited by my exalted wife, Hope Bohannic, who is one of the most incredible people I've ever met, if not the most incredible person. And she's really kind of been really seminal in defining this kind of emergent field of the humane hoax within the animal rights philosophy. And I also want to say a special thanks to her and to Ashley Capps for helping to obtain some of the source material that I use here as well too. So thank you very much for that. So what exactly is do-it-yourself slaughter? It's also referred to as backyard slaughter. It's really when this kind of increase in movement, it's part of the larger like urban homestead and do-it-yourself sort of movement, which involves killing the animals oneself before consuming them rather than purchasing the byproducts of the animal that has been slaughtered by someone else. As a theologian, I'm kind of disturbed by the language around do-it-yourself slaughter that's increasingly spiritual. So that's kind of what I'm looking at and analyzing here in this paper. So just to give you an example of how this spiritual language is used in do-it-yourself slaughter, I'll have a few quotes here, forgive me if they're a little disturbing, but just to instantiate what I'm talking about here. So quote, this is from one of these websites. If the animal is small, I hold it while it passes. I hold it so that I never take for granted the life that leaves. I hold it so that perhaps it can feel my love and take some comfort from my gratitude. If the animal is large, I lay my hand upon them. Even as I cut the throat, I lay my hand upon them and I pray for them. As their blood feeds the ground, I honor them. And then it is done. I ease them out. I pray for their spirit so that it passes to where its journey continues. I ask their soul to be a guardian of our homestead. Their presence is always welcome here. So if we look at some of these terms, love, gratitude, comfort, pray, ease, spirit, the ones that I've just highlighted here, it's kind of hard to believe just seeing these words strung together that what we're talking about is a pretty violent act of like taking an animal's life. I actually Googled part of this and I came up with, I think, a Walt Whitman poem that had a lot of word matches with this as well too. So these words alone don't really at all express the kind of violence of the act of slaughter itself. There's obviously a pretty glaring contradiction between terms like love and gratitude and giving and care and prayer and all of those, and the actual act of killing itself, which is like a form of doublespeak, we'll see, to make killing seem as though it's somehow compassionate or benevolent, right? While occluding and hiding the brutality of the violent act itself. So I'm going to look at why this kind of do-it-yourself spirituality is problematic. In the paper, I talk about spiritual bypass, but I also talk about it in terms of a form of manipulation. So we should define what exactly is meant by spiritual bypass. And Wellwood is the one who coined the term. So I'm going to use some quotes to define how he uses it and how other psychotherapists and other psychologists use it. So, quote, spiritual bypass is when there is a widespread tendency to use spiritual ideas and practices to sidestep or avoid facing unresolved emotional issues, psychological wounds, and unfinished developmental tasks. So again, this is, it's a term that has wide currency by psychotherapists and psychologists to talk about how an appeal to spirituality is used to rationalize the avoidance of dealing with some of the person's own issues. And in the case of psychologists, they lean heavily on psychological issues. But I'm not a psychologist. I'm an ethicist and a theologian, so that makes me a theo-ethicist. So I'm really trying to understand how this psychological findings of Wellwood and others can be used in terms of an ethical context, right? In terms of how one manipulates oneself and actually distorts one's ability to perceive the truth, which will be central to my critique here. But also in forms of manipulation, it's a form of manipulation of others as well too. Again, to show how something that's inherently violent and hurtful can be construed as somehow loving and caring, right? So when we're projecting out to others, that would be a form of manipulating others. But as spiritual bypass, it's actually how we manipulate, how a person manipulates themselves. So I'm extending the idea of spiritual bypass a little bit to understand it in terms of theology and ethical terms, and to show anytime spiritual jargon is used to dismiss the reality of killing animals for one's own purpose. And I will note that most people who are animal rights activists and longtime vegans are actually pretty used to this type of language of spiritual bypass. We're used to people saying things like, oh, it's part of the cycle of life. Oh, I pray for the spirit of the animal. Oh, I give them gratitude, and my gratitude leads them into the next life and on their journey. We hear this with just standard meat eating. So the arguments that I propose here actually can be extended not just to spiritual bypass, but to the consumption of animals in general whenever the spiritual language is used to justify the act of killing and make it seem like it's something that it patently is not, that is some sort of form of love and care. I also should mention that I'm a little bit extra agitated and frustrated right now because I've spent the last 2 days arguing with a religious community to which I belong against some practitioners who are using spiritual bypass, the language of spirituality, to justify racism, homophobia, and misogyny, and how they use spiritual language in that way. So spiritual bypass can be used for social issues in general. So I might talk about psychological issues, but I'm not speaking as a clinical psychologist. I'm using the term psychological issues as a sort of axiom, where as an ethicist, if someone conflates violence with love, as an ethicist, I consider that to be a psychological issue, right? And so there's a kind of like uncomfortable overlap where ethics and psychology get really close, and I'm just acknowledging that I'm kind of dangerously crossing over outside of my area of expertise. So I just want to be clear that I'm not speaking as a psychologist, but rather as a theologian and an ethicist. That's really, it's just how we can understand the work of psychologists in terms of ethics and theology is really my thought there. Okay. So again, I'm just basically making the same points here about how spiritual bypass is a form of self-deception. Okay, so it's important here to note the glaring contradiction. Again, now we're kind of going into the realm of theology, where articulations of spirituality across cultures and religions tend to emphasize a pursuit of higher truth. That's the kind of language that we see in religious and spiritual language, is the idea that we're going to somehow get a more holistic perspective or higher perspective on reality that will contextualize suffering of the herein, of the world as we know it, that somehow a higher perspective of truth can somehow lessen the pain that we feel in our day-to-day existence. And that tends to be the language of spiritual traditions and religious traditions, that of pursuing truth. Now, spiritual bypass is the opposite of that. It's a form of self-deception. It's when you're actually deceiving yourself rather than an honest pursuit of higher truth. So by definition then, if spirituality is concerned with the revelation of truth and bypass is a form of self-deception, then really spiritual bypass is at odds with genuine spirituality, right? And what I'll start talking about is, because of this contradiction between spiritual bypass being self-deception, spirituality being about pursuit of higher truth, then what happens is spiritual bypass will then start to employ pseudo-spirituality that's at odds. So we can see the glaring contradiction between self-deception and pursuit of truth here. And of course, this will then lead to what we've noticed in our first quote of what we can call double speaking, right? Where the spiritual practitioner or the do-it-yourself practitioner is using spiritual language to bypass the reality of the situation. That reality is exploitation rather than care. So there's no amount of language that we can use to cover up the fact that violence cannot be understood as love, right? Now, George Orwell coined the term doublespeak to talk about how the government, right, or those who have power will use language to call something what it's not, like war is peace, for example, to deceive the people into manufacture consent, right, which is another term that was popularized by Noam Chomsky. But in this case, we're manufacturing our own consent. We're deceiving ourselves with spiritual doublespeak. But it still can't change the fact that you cannot consider violence to be love. So we can see in the opening passage terms like love, gratitude, comfort, prayer, ease, spirit, etc. are not an accurate description of the act of killing because they convey a sense of care rather than exploitation. So rather, the more accurate description would be language of exploitation rather than language of love and care. Because what is the slaughterer doing when they're taking the life of an animal? Well, first, they're overpowering the agency of the animal. The animal doesn't want to die. The animal would prefer to live, right? So that's domination, right? The animal's ability to choose life over death is completely subdued, right? And if we look at that reality of the situation of domineering and overpowering, that's the language of exploitation, right? But that's the exact opposite of love. Love is not domineering and overpowering the agency of the other, right? Love, if we can agree on this term, is actually a profound act of giving of oneself. It's when you're thinking of the interests of the others, perhaps even before your own interests. But love, by definition, is a profound act of giving of oneself. Love that's based on taking from the other, of subjugating the agency and the will and the desires of the other, that's exploitation. That's not love. That's violence. That's not care. And it's important that we recognize that this is empirically false to try to consider killing an act of love. So the killer, the butcher in this case, is not being honest about the situation. Bypassing is characterized by going around one's own rational faculties, not looking at reality as it is rationally, right? So by not being honest about the situation, that it's an act of domination and exploitation rather than that of love and care, the slaughterer is bypassing their rational faculties, but beyond that, they're bypassing their affective faculties. And that means to say they're bypassing their own emotional constituency. And as an ethicist, I'm largely concerned with what's called feminist care ethics, which takes the idea that our emotional states are worthy of serious consideration when it comes to ethical grounding, right? And because we have the capacity to feel love and compassion, that it's actually a human need to feel love and compassion, not just towards ourselves, but to express it as well. And this is betrayed in the language of spiritual slaughter, spiritual bypass in the do-it-yourself slaughter. We can see that there's this need for love and compassion that's expressed, but then it's actually bypassed and compartmentalized in the actual act of killing itself. So we can see how this is bypassed, not just rationally, and that it doesn't make sense to call killing love when it's domineering and exploitation, but it's also bypassing our own affective, emotional needs. And we have a need to be loving and to be caring, and it's bypassing that. And so this is why I say it indicates some sort of deeper psychological issues, because there seems to be a mistaking of love for violence. I mean, think about that. That's kind of a disturbing pattern. If I were being abused by somebody and I was mistaking that abuse for love, that would create some pretty serious psychological issues. Also, if I were an abuser and in the act of abusing another, I was considering that an act of love, we can see how those really betray deeper psychological issues. Whether those are from a psychology perspective or an ethical perspective, I think both can be said to be true, but I can't speak with authority as a psychologist. I can only say, as an ethicist, if you think that violence is love, you got some issues, some psychological issues from an ethical perspective. So let's look at this. This argument gets a little bit complex, and please forgive me and bear with me. But spiritual bypass can be also understood as a form of a self-confirmation bias. This is going to lead us into discussions about the ego, which is of central importance to spiritual talk and to spiritual progress. And so I'm going to start by basically laying out how this is a self-confirmation bias, right? Now, self-confirmation bias, of course, is another way of understanding spiritual bypass socially and ethically rather than just psychologically. But a self-confirmation bias, for those of you who don't know, it's a means of self-deception whereby a person has a tendency to see what they want to see or see what they think they're going to see, what they expect to see, even if it's contradicted by empirical data. Okay, now this is really important because as a social scientist, I'm not a social scientist or a natural scientist, but the social scientists and natural scientists are experts on the self-confirmation bias because they create this process of double-blind, controlled, peer-reviewed study to actually mitigate the otherwise inevitable effect of a self-confirmation bias. Even researchers who are trained to think objectively will still see what they think they should see or see what they want to see. And that way, and so scientific studies are done in a way to prevent that from happening, just long and the short without going too much into the methodology of objective sciences. But as I've proposed, the self-confirmation bias can be related to what spiritualists would call the ego. Okay, so now I'm moving out of natural sciences and social sciences and into the realm of spirituality here, right? So in conventional spiritual language, the ego is, the term ego is used, and I'm not using this in a Freudian psychology way. I'm using this just in like conventional spiritual languages. This will become a translation of various terms from Sanskrit, ahankara or asmita or something like that. But this is across Abrahamic religions as well too, where ego tends to refer to that part of us that's so entrenched with the drama of worldly life that we become selfish and self-centered. We think of ourselves at the expense of others. That is the worldly ego. And that's what spiritual processes and spiritual paths tend to want to mitigate. They want to transform the ego, that part of us that pits us against others, that isolates us and makes us self-centered and selfish. That's really what we're referring to when we're talking about the ego, that which pursues pleasure rather than what's good, right? So for example, it may be pleasurable to eat meat, but it's not good. It's not good ethically. It's not good environmentally. It's not good for the animal. It's not good for so many reasons. But the ego is that part of us that doesn't care about the greater good, only cares about what's good for the ego, for selfish pursuits of pleasure, okay? So that's what I'm talking about when I'm referring to the ego. It's that part of us. It also rationalizes, right? It has a way of telling us that which is bad is good, right? And in the case of spirituality, it can use spiritual language to rationalize that what is bad is good, thereby confirming what we already want. Okay, let's say we want to eat a steak, right? Well, the ego will rationalize, will convince us that that's good, even if it's not. Okay, and then this becomes a spiritual issue when the ego uses spiritual language to confirm that what we want with our taste buds is somehow good when it's actually only pleasurable, for example. So the ego actually is a self-deceiving mechanism that is at odds with an honest assessment of what the situation is, right? So Kaplan, actually this is from a book, Eyes Wide Open. I happen to have it sitting right here. It's a fantastic book. On a variety of different spiritual issues. But she says the ego simultaneously experiences the possibility of authentic transformation as a literal death threat. And by authentic transformation, what she's referring to is the idea that in most spiritual paths, the idea that selfish part of us, that self-centered part of us that pits us against the interests of others, that creates disharmony between us and others, that getting rid of that propensity, that tendency of ourselves is largely what spiritual processes are involved in, making us less self-centered, right? And so based on that, when one engages in a genuine spiritual transformation, then the ego considers that to be a death threat, because we're literally like trying to get rid of that self-centered tendency, right? And so according to Kaplan, the ego may respond by actually co-opting the language of truth and transformation. Again, we're back to rationalizing and self-confirmation. We can look at this as a defense mechanism, right? And I think we know what a defense mechanism is when somebody knows what they're doing is wrong somehow within them, but then will rationalize it. They'll use rational language to justify it. Again, this is a function of the ego in spiritual terms. So Chogyam Trungpa writes about spiritual materialism, and a lot of the psychologists who were inspired to define the terms of spiritual bypass were very inspired by Chogyam Trungpa's discussions on spiritual materialism. And he points out this interesting thing that the ego will actually attempt to convert anything to its own use, even spirituality itself too. And I think this is why so often people are turned off to religion in general, is because what they see is people using religious language to justify their own egotism, right? Well, what I'm proposing here is that's not authentic spirituality. That's actually a case in point of spiritual bypass. And it's important that we distinguish between spirituality and authentic religion, one that is really interested in transformation and bettering oneself and seeing a higher truth, right? Versus that which is inauthentic pseudo-spirituality, which is where the ego is just, basically co-opting and misappropriating spiritual language just to justify bad behavior. So it's important that we make that distinction there, where the ego can distort spiritual teachings to become a means of self-pursuit. Okay, so they're related. The idea of a defense mechanism and a self-confirmation bias in the ego. These are all interrelated concepts. And just to spell that out a little more clearly, spiritual bypass is a form of self-confirmation bias, is when one's ego appropriates spirituality towards one's own selfish ends, employing spirituality as a means to justify selfish pursuits, and even objectifying spirituality as an object of consumption rather than the subject of meaningful personal transformation. It's kind of a run-on sentence, forgive me. But basically, if we just put all the concepts of self-confirmation, defense mechanism, and ego together, and shows how the ego will then, for its own selfish pursuits, co-opt spiritual language to rationalize selfish behavior, rather than to actually challenge and transform selfishness, which would be the path of genuine, authentic spirituality. Okay, so that's kind of, again, I know it's an earful, but that's kind of the proposition here. So we can see that this is leading to ego-driven pseudo-spirituality. I've basically laid out the model more or less. So instead of becoming more spiritual, what comes off is more of a pretense of spirituality. And I think we all know what that feels like, where somebody's using religious or spiritual language, in a way that's kind of hurtful to others. And just, what is the statement? I've heard somebody say something like, when you think that God hates all the same people that you hate, that would be an example of kind of your ego co-opting spirituality. And again, it's kind of sad how common that type of bypassing is in spiritual communities, where spirituality is used to reinforce the ego rather than challenge the ego. And what I'm proposing is that's not authentic. It's not. It's by definition self-deception, a defense mechanism, and at odds with the stated values of pursuing higher truth. And the result is that one becomes more self-centered rather than less self-centered. So let's look at an example of how this language occurs in the do-it-yourself community. A nearby herbalist raises sheep for meat and dairy. This is a quote from the article, as you can see by the quote marks there. When she slaughters them, she has a whole ritual. She sings to them and straddles them like she's riding them, and then cuts their throat. And now we see the doublespeak entering. She calls it giving death. She says they're always calm and accepting of their fate. She's very clear that it's a gift. So again, we see the tone of the actual, there's part of a much larger article that is, has got this really spiritual tone about how killing is so spiritual. And in this case, we see the doublespeak, where the act of, a profound act of taking is construed as giving. I mean, there's no greater act of taking than killing, right? I mean, you're literally taking that which is not what's giving, you know? The life of another is not yours to take. And to consider that to be a sense of giving, again, we have a situation where the ego is using spiritual language to justify and reinforce one's own selfish pursuits at the extent of others, right? You can't call this giving in any meaningful sense of the term. So this is an example of self-deception. I mean, it's also manipulation in the sense that it's making others think that. But again, I'm not addressing that in the current, in this current presentation. That will be in the paper. So it's unethical because you're literally deceiving others. But I really believe the language of do-it-yourselfers to be genuine. I believe that they believe what they're saying here, and therefore it's an act of self-deception, spiritual bypass, right? Again, a defense mechanism to not face up to the real hurtful consequences of one's selfish, ego-driven actions. And again, ego-driven actions are at odds with authentic spirituality. Okay, here's another pretty, for lack of better words, perverse example of self-deception. This language is really, really common in do-it-yourselfers in their blogs and such. And you can see how kind of peculiar this is, okay? So quote, this is a do-it-yourselfer who's engaged in a lamb slaughter of all things. Quote, inside the space of silence, I think I could stand to die here. Here in this pasture, under these mountains, this sky. If when my time someone comes, lays me down in green grass and soothes my body, and someone I love then lovingly cuts my throat, and my blood runs into the grass and fertilizes the soil, and my body is used for food and necessity, I could handle that. So again, this is pretty extreme self-deception where violence is perceived as loving, selfishness is perceived as caring. And this is a really important point. Imagine being killed by somebody who is loving to you. Imagine being killed by a friend or a lover or a parent. And all of those affections are probably mixed when somebody has a loving relationship with an animal. Now, Hope and I wrote a book called The Ultimate Betrayal, and in that we proposed that when you're killing an animal that you have a loving relationship with, it doesn't make the act of killing more ethical. Rather, it may even make it less ethical in the sense that not only are you killing and stealing the animal's life, but now you have the added infraction of actually betraying. So if you can imagine actually being killed by somebody you have a loving relationship with, aside from the fear and the pain and the horror that you'd be feeling, you would also be feeling this really profound sense of betrayal. And I believe I cited Dante's Inferno in The Ultimate Betrayal, where, you know, Dante considers betrayal to be the center of hell, like the worst layers of hell are saved for those who betray. And whether you take that literal or figuratively, I think the point comes across the same, that it's pretty kind of perverse to think that somehow you'd be okay with somebody you love killing you. And also what I'll notice here is that this is problematic with basing one's ethics on the golden rule alone. What happens is one thinks that do unto others as that you would have done unto you. But the problem with the golden rule type ethics is that, like, how do you know how you would feel if somebody you loved was killing you? How can you know? Well, you can't. So you can't say, oh, you know, if I were in their shoes, I'd be fine, right? I'd be okay with that, is what the thesis of this statement was. But how can this person know? They can't know. So golden rule ethics doesn't apply here, right? And actually, golden rule style ethics in this case becomes a means of justifying and rationalizing unethical behavior rather than a standard for ethical behavior. And it's important to note the dangerous limitations of the golden rule as being overly abstract and not adequately consulting our affective capacities, our emotional capacities to care, which is one of the many reasons why I'm a feminist care ethic, is because it allows for that. So the scene that she lays out seems more like euthanasia, not a situation where somebody's giving or dying of their free will, as would be the case of animal slaughter, right? Again, this is bypassing the reality of the situation, and it doesn't really address the issue that one requires care and love to be progressing spiritually, and killing another being can't qualify as that. We have a deep need to be caring, loving beings, and that's contradicted by the act of killing, and therefore would be contrary to spiritual progress if we see progress being compassion and love being important, which by the do-it-yourselfer's own language, they do see it as important. They just don't seem to recognize it's contradicting that. So another pattern that Wellwood points out with spiritual bypass is what he calls premature transcendence. And again, forgive me if this gets a little thick. But as an eco-theologian, I do eco-theology, the critique of transcendence is one that every religion has to address. And that's the critique that we as spiritual people, we as theologians, we as religious practitioners get so hung up thinking about the spiritual higher realm, the transcendental realm, that it causes us to devalue what's happening here. And when that happens, instead of creating a sense of harmony between what's here and what's transcendental, it creates a disharmony because we become negligent and removed from the needs of others. And we'll inspect that a little bit. So premature transcendence, in this case, is when one behaves when they're as if they're above the consequences of material action because they're so focused on a transcendental higher spiritual reality. One actually can deny one's own humanness. In the case of being a killer, a butcher, using spiritual language to act like it's somehow above the fact that, you know, there's a very human process of killing and violence that's going on here. And, you know, really absolute truth is used to disparage or dismiss. And this is the words of Wellwood. Again, he's focused on the psychological applications of this. And he interestingly calls this an occupational hazard of the spiritual path. And this is why it's a really quick, easy point of criticism against spirituality and religion in general, is because you can see that a lot of spiritualists and religious people will dismiss worldly problems by focusing on and using spiritual language, right? And every responsible theologian needs to be able to answer this critique. And it's an occupational hazard of seeing a higher spiritual truth, as that if you focus on that so much, you start to fail to recognize the importance of integrating this world with our transcendental spiritual ideas. Again, I'm sorry if that's kind of heady, but it is a standard critique that theo-ethicists all have to deal with. You know, it's really kind of point number one as a theologian. You have to deal with that, right? So in this case, you know, the slaughterer is dismissing the empirical truth regarding the experience of the animal by focusing on some supposedly higher spiritual truth, right? And again, this is kind of a psychological issue as well, too, because one is being dismissive of their own conscience and their own compassion and care and aspects of their psychology. Again, I take it as fundamental and axiomatic that we all have a need to be compassionate and loving. And then when we act in a way that contradicts that, we compartmentalize, we separate our desires, our being, our nature as loving, compassionate beings from our actions. We create a disharmony between self and others. We create a fragmentation rather than a harmony. And that's what happens when one engages in premature transcendence. Basically, there's a dismissal of the very real and worldly experience of the animal victims. So let's look at an example of this in spiritual do-it-yourself language. I don't name anybody's names here, but so-and-so feels such compassion for a bird before he kills it that the killing has become something of an esoteric experience for him. And this is him speaking, quote, "I decided I needed to do this myself, not only to have an alternative to the economy of slaughter of animals en masse, but also to have a spiritual practice." So here, killing is considered a esoteric spiritual practice. Maybe a little too esoteric. So again, you can see how this is rising above the actual violence that's committing and not directly engaging. You know, the killer, the perpetrator here, the butcher, is making themselves at peace with an action that can in no way be considered peaceful. There's a pretty profound cognitive dissonance there when one construes something that's inherently violent as being peaceful. Again, back to the spiritual doublespeak. And again, one is bypassing not only the experience of the animals, but bypassing one's own rational ability to see what's the action for what it really is, and then bypassing one's own affective, emotional needs of our psychology, right? And pretending it's all spiritual in the process, hence becoming a textbook example of spiritual bypassing. And it's important to notice also that it's not like they don't value compassion and they don't value love. The very language that they're using shows, it betrays that that's what they value. There just seems to be a failure to recognize the disintegration between their words and their actions, and that's the problem. And it's also important to underscore really that this leads to disconnection rather than connection, right? And if your spiritual path is creating a sense of disconnection between yourself and others, we can actually question whether that's an authentic spiritual path, because disconnection is a function of disharmony, and we would expect authentic spiritual path to bring about a sense of harmony with others rather than disharmony. And that's kind of the bottom line here.
Hojan?
Yeah.
Just to let you know, you have 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you. So I've made the point about premature transcendence. The next thing I would like to make a point and that I would leave on is the idea of holism here. Okay, I've made a lot of these points here as well too. Let me get to the slide about holism. Oh, here we go. So again, what happens with this type of language is one's compartmentalizing. That is, one's creating a different compartment where one needs and loves and has a need for love and compassion, and then has another compartment where one is engaged in violence, right? There's also compartmentalization between one's own self, one's own selfish ego, pursuit of their desires, namely meat eating, right, in the interests of the other, right? So we see this kind of disintegration within the self of the person, but a disintegration between self and others, right? And a disintegration from the very truth of the situation. And that's what happens, right? So that creates a disharmonious relationship rather than the harmony that we would expect from a true spiritual path, right? And it's also important to know that common to spiritual language across world religions and spiritual traditions is the idea of overcoming the disintegration, disharmony, and compartmentalization of worldly isolation, egoism, etc. So it's at odds with what we would think of is the integration. We can call this holism, right? Holism is the idea that we need to integrate not only ourselves, our words, our speech, our actions. If we love and value compassion and care, then our actions should reflect that. But it's not just an integration between oneself, but it's integration between our own needs and desires and those of others, in this case, animals, right? But also an integration between that and a larger sense of harmony. That's really what true holism is about. And holism tends to be the language of spirituality and religion, right? So this is all contradicted by the act of this. And you can see here, I just used some quotes of how the value of holism is actually in the self-admission of spiritual do-it-yourself language. You know, you see the synergy of life and death, right? And what the implications of this, and I think we've all heard as meat eaters that, you know, you tell people, oh, you know, I don't eat meat. And they're like, oh, I just honor the cycle of life and death, you know, the cycle of life. And you can hear like the soundtrack for the Lion King practically playing behind you when they say this, as if somehow by not participating in killing, we're somehow disintegrating ourselves from the cycle of life and death. That's what the implication is. Oh, I have a more holistic approach to reality because I honor the process of life and death, therefore I participate in it by killing, right? This is kind of what's beneath the do-it-yourself slaughterers, but this, we all know this from being vegans and animal rights activists. We've heard this a million times, but this is a naturalistic fallacy. It's kind of basically saying that our morality and our ethics should be based on what happens. Therefore, you know, if animals behave in a way that's violent, we should therefore behave in a way of violence. But it's really it's quite contradictory to that, really. The true disintegration is when one participates in violence and therefore disintegrates oneself from the interests of being harmonious with others. And the real holism, true holism, would be to not perpetuate violence, rather than to perpetuate violence, which is the real disintegration of one's harmony with others. So it's important that we use that as rebuttal when you know, we hear this the cycle of life argument, as if it's some sort of pretense to holism, but it's not true holism. It is compartmentalization, it's disintegration, it's a disintegration, a disharmony between self and others, and it's the disintegration, disharmony within ourselves, where we have a deep need to be loving and caring, and yet our actions work in an opposite way, thereby disintegrating our own psyche and our own emotions and our own thoughts, words, and actions. So that's an important rebuttal that we can see here in being used. And you can also see just the empirical fact of the situation. I love the animal that I'm eating, but domination and exploitation cannot be considered love, because love is giving rather than taking. So again, this is another form of disintegration where one's words are no longer truthful at all. So this is a complete fragmentation, creating egoism and self-centeredness in the process of this sort of like pseudo-spirituality that's being passed off here. So what I would do is I would end this by saying that, you know, this is spiritual bypass, right? Killing is not an act of spiritual holism. It's an act of profound disintegration and isolation. And it's spiritual bypass insofar as we have a need for integration, but do yourself language and uses spirituality to work against our own need for spiritual integration and spiritual holism. That's a very, very important point. So really, I think it's also important, and I believe that Hope probably has made some points about this as well, is that, you know, this is it's a critique, it's a harsh critique, but I'm not trying to dehumanize the practitioners by reducing them to their entire identity, the worst element, which is like, you know, the propensity to mistake love for violence, right? Really, I do take their critiques to be, their statements to be genuine. I believe that they genuinely believe that they're engaged in some sort of spiritual process. A lot of them complain about vegan bullying, and this is very important that we don't allow this to happen, because what happens is, even though they're the perpetrators of violence, once they can claim to be victims, they can create sympathy on the part of the audience. So for example, if we bully a do-it-yourself slaughterer by levying critiques that are not in good faith, then they claim to be the victims, right? And our message no longer gets heard. So I'm really trying not to do that. I'm trying to be charitable and assuming that they may even have some spiritual realization, but their actions are at odds with this. And it's not surprising that, you know, the human psyche is complex enough that we can be well developed in some ways and not developed in other ways. And so really what I'm just calling for is that the spiritual, those who are doing do-it-yourself in terms of spiritual language, don't just bypass the reality of the situation, but actually start to look at how they can integrate their thoughts and their actions in a sense of real, honest holism. So that's my statement that I end with here, is that I pray that the do-it-yourselfers might consider that it's critical that any of us who are on the spiritual path do not bypass by employing spirituality as a means of reinforcing rather than attenuating our egotistical tendency towards self-centeredness. So bypassing prevents a true integration and harmony between transcendence, immanence, within our own selves, thoughts, words, actions, with that of the others and self. And that's achieved best by a vegan diet and a vegan lifestyle. Okay, and that would be the end by my clock to the second.
Oh, my clock 3 minutes over, but that's okay.
Oh, you took some of my time on the intro.
No problem. All right. Thank you so much, Kojin. Very enlightening, and I hope everyone enjoyed it.